Well, thanks to the panel for a beautiful dissection of the role that pricing is going to play in beginning to realign us all in a new and evolving ecosystem. I think I was struck by one of the things that Katrina said. I think one of the things that's most noticeable that in cardiovascular care is that the time from something reaching the guidelines to actually being implemented fully is a median of 12 to 15 years for a drug or an intervention. So I do think we have a lot to bear in terms of responsibility for some of the denominators, the timelines that underlie a lot of the pricing issues that were discussed. We're moving now on to our next panel, which is discussing another set of expensive but remarkably effective technologies, emerging devices for complex structural heart disease. And the moderator of this session is Jason Mills. Jason is the Managing Director and the Head of U.S. Healthcare Research for Canaccord Genuity. And he is really one of the world's leading analysts in the medical space with a particular expertise in medical devices. Jason, welcome to you and the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here moderating a panel with such esteemed folks in the areas of medical devices and structural heart. So I'd like to take a second just to introduce the experts here, and I'll try to step out of the way as much as possible because the knowledge is certainly to the left of me. Starting to my left, we have Mike Dale, who's the Divisional Vice President and General Manager in Structural Heart for Abbott. Next to him is Ian Meredith, who is the Executive Vice President and Global Chief Medical Officer for Boston Scientific, and himself a very distinguished physician in his past. Next to him is Dr. Patrick O'Gara, who's the Watkins Family Distinguished Chair in Cardiology at the Brigham, as well as the Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School. Next to Dr. O'Gara is Stanton Rowe, who's the Corporate Vice President of Advanced Technology and Chief Scientific Officer for Edwards Lifesciences. And last but certainly not least at the end is Sean Salmon, who's Senior Vice President and President of Coronary and Structural Heart for Medtronic. And we are charged today to talk about one of the most fascinating areas, in my view, as an analyst covering the space in medical devices, and that being emerging devices for structural heart. And I'd like to start off with what I thought was a staggering statistic. A study published in Lancet estimated that more than 1 out of every 10 folks in the U.S. over 75 years of age have either moderate or severe mitral regurgitation. This prevalence is nearly 2.5 times greater than the prevalence of moderate and severe aortic valve disease. Yet, there are approximately 3 times more interventions, surgical or increasingly transcatheter interventions to treat aortic valve disease. In a speech I saw him give on a subject last year, a well-known thought leader in the field captured the essence of this treatment discrepancy by saying, "When I see aortic stenosis, I TAVR it. When I see severe mitral regurgitation, I think about it." So, Dr. O'Gara, I'd like to turn to you as our resident physician on the panel, and I'd like you to lead off the discussion on emerging devices to treat complex structural heart disease by sort of maybe giving us your insight into why this discrepancy exists. What are we waiting for? And sort of within your answer, give us a baseline for the mitral apparatus and the complexity of the mitral valve.
Well, thanks, Jason, and I really appreciate this opportunity to be the odd man out on this panel. It's always great, though, to be with friends and colleagues, many people that I've known for a long period of time in the structural heart disease space. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term structural heart disease, it generally refers to patients who have complex valvular heart disease and occasionally refers to patients who have holes in their heart from either a congenital or acquired basis. And you're very familiar with the story of transcatheter aortic valve replacement. It has actually now been 15 years since the first in-man implantation of a transcatheter aortic valve by Alain Cribier in France. It's only been 5.5 years since the Food and Drug Administration approved the use of transcatheter aortic valve replacement in the United States for treatment of patients with severe symptomatic aortic stenosis. 5.5 years. Currently, there are over 500 sites in the United States that provide transcatheter aortic valve replacement services. And it is estimated that in the United States, the volume of transcatheter aortic valve replacements will exceed the volume of surgical aortic valve replacements at some point within the next year. We owe a great deal of gratitude to our colleagues who have designed randomized controlled trials, and many of the people here that you see in front of you are members of organizations and device companies that have actually put patients first and come up with rigorous trial designs by which the United States has truly been a leader in establishing scientifically the value, the safety, and the efficacy of this kind of approach. Now, as Jason pointed out, the mitral valve problem may actually exceed that of the aortic valve problem. You're familiar also in the United States as well as worldwide, the fastest growing segment of the population are those over the age of 65. And in the 75 and older year age group, the prevalence of significant mitral valve disease is about 7.5% to 10%, at least in the United States and Western Europe. We're not talking about the millions of people in Africa, Southeast Asia, China, and South America who have rheumatic disease. They're almost even not on any of the maps that we consider when trying to analyze where it is that our devices might first go. I think the audience should understand there's a huge difference between the aortic valve and the mitral valve. So the aortic valve is like 3 downs in a cloud of dust. The Woody Hayes approach to cardiology. It stays right where it is. You can see it on an X-ray. You can see it on an echocardiogram. It's this big mass of calcium that doesn't go anywhere, and you can fit something inside of it, either under echo guidance or fluoroscopic guidance. Now, the mitral valve, on the other hand, is like a Mozart concerto. There are 5 or maybe 6 elements of the mitral valve, all of which need to play together in order to maintain competence of the structure. So there is an order of magnitude difference between designing devices that can take care of aortic stenosis and designing devices that can take care of mitral regurgitation. There's no question that our patients want this kind of technology. I can't remember the last patient who offered that he or she would be willing to undergo a median sternotomy, cardiopulmonary bypass, and general anesthesia if they had a choice to have a catheter placed through their femoral artery and go home the following day. That's not a conversation that really takes a great deal of sophistication to get to the end of. But the mitral valve space, I think we're just getting started. It's very, very exciting. It's incredibly complicated. And it's an area in which there must be this very tight coordination between the physician community, the hospital community, the device industry, FDA, CMS, all working in the best interests of patients. We have to be very careful about making sure that we align the expectations of the patient community with actually the stage of development at which we are currently at. Expectations are wildly unrealistic, and we all have to spend a great deal of time recognizing the incremental improvements in this technology that have to go forward before it becomes available on a widespread basis. And I look forward to the rest of the discussion here in the next hour so that we can come to some kind of a consensus.
Thank you, Dr. O'Gara. And that's a good place to segue. Perhaps Dr. Meredith, as a former physician and now working on innovation with Boston Scientific, I'll start with you, and I certainly want to get the viewpoints of your colleagues as well. What is the current state of the art? Dr. O'Gara mentioned how long we've been working on aortic devices for transcatheter treatment of aortic valve disease. What's the current state of the art at this point in time from your perspective, maybe as a physician, with your physician hat on first, and then your innovator hat in mitral valve?
Thanks, Jason, and thank you to Partners Healthcare for inviting not only me to be part of this, but Boston Scientific to be part of this fantastic forum. I've enjoyed every part of it, and bravo, Pat. That was a great insight into aortic valve disease and indeed mitral, the complexity of mitral valve disease. The state of the art might be a big statement for mitral regurgitation. I think we're in a state of flux rather than the state of the art. I think we understand guideline-directed medical therapy as the underpinning of the treatment of functional mitral regurgitation, which really is a condition associated with heart failure and has to be seen in the context of heart failure. And we understand the options available for degenerative mitral valve disease. And we have great surgical predicates for degenerative mitral valve disease. I think the state that we're in at the moment is that we see that there's probably about 40 to 50 startup companies, and all of the main strategic companies also have investments and development projects in various aspects of dealing with the mitral valve. Now, as Pat said before, the mitral valve is not like the aortic valve. The mitral valve is like having a suit made by a tailor. I like this analogy because I think it helps me understand the complexity. The aortic valve is really taking your pants into the tailor and just saying, I want the hem changed, that's it. And that's your one option. The mitral valve requires a delicate approach to every aspect of making a suit, whether lengthening the sleeves or altering the jacket or taking the pants in at the waist or hemming the pants. It's not one single thing. So you have to understand the mechanism of the problem in mitral valve disease, particularly functional mitral regurgitation. You have to understand the mechanism and which of the elements that Pat mentioned before are really responsible for the mitral regurgitation at a particular phase of the disease. And therefore, the state we are in at present is understanding the role of various repair options, whether it be leaflet, cord, annulus, or a combination thereof, and the various replacement options and the limitations for replacement, access, annular calcification, and many other factors, which I'm sure that we'll discuss throughout the course of this session. Clearly, we have first-in-human trials of excellent transapical and transeptal mitral valve replacement strategies, and we have a number of different options in play at various stages of development for mitral repair. And the balance of where we will end up with mitral repair as opposed to replacement is a great fruitful topic for discussion. So perhaps I should leave that there, Jason, and say it's in play but hardly the state of art.
That's helpful. I'd like to get the viewpoints of the other three from industry, maybe starting here with Mike and then Stanton and Sean weighing in as well. As we think about the future, what the future looks like in terms of treating this disease, talk about what sort of innovations and challenges to innovate you face as innovators in the space to develop devices that treat the mitral apparatus. Are we talking about a homogeneous patient population, Or are we talking about a more heterogeneous patient population? And does that inform, whether it's homogeneous or heterogeneous, what sort of toolbox approach you may need as companies to offer products to the physicians to treat? Mike, you want to start?
Sure, thank you. I think the simplest way to frame the challenge that we face when we look at trying to provide solutions to these patients is that we ensure that the solution doesn't create a greater risk than the disease they're suffering from. And that has been the classic conundrum of Class 3 medical device development from time immemorial. I think where we're all excited today when we think about the opportunities to treat mitral valve disease, regardless of the nature of that disease, is that we have learned a lot by virtue of the benchmarks that we have in comparing these solutions to that of surgery. So for surgery, the standard of care, the state of the art, if you will, is the treatment of DMR with experienced techniques and approaches that literally restore normal function again to these individuals who suffer from that disease. However, as these patients become more fragile, as their disease extends, the opportunity to intervene surgically can sometimes create a greater risk and therefore challenge the risk-benefit proposition that that solution might offer. So with these less invasive procedures, our challenge is to maintain that equipoise, that balance in terms of the benefit we've provided. And in recent years, over the last 10 years with the Abbott's MitraClip platform, I think what we have learned is the notion that absolute, complete, 100% resolution of the MR is not a requirement in order to provide genuine, useful clinical benefit to that patient in terms of functional measures as well as quality of life. And so therein lies the general paradigm that we try to organize our solutions around is first do no harm, and then let's decide how much we can do and how we can provide the measurable reduction in mitral valve regurgitation.
That's helpful. Stan, would you like to weigh in on that as well?
Sure. There's lots of opportunity to serve a large number of patients in this area. There's 2.5 million patients in the United States with moderate to severe mitral regurgitation, and there's 50,000 surgical procedures. Well, why the big difference? Well, the largest number of these patients are those with this FMR, functional mitral regurgitation, and these are patients defined by having bad left ventricles. In other words, they're already very, very sick, and so doing open heart surgery on them is a risky business, and so only a small percentage of those patients actually get surgery. So the large opportunity for all of us is to have this very minimally invasive, preferably percutaneous approach to treating mitral regurgitation in these very sick patients. And that's always a challenging paradigm to start with. So I think approaching these patients percutaneously gives us the opportunity to treat them without damaging the heart. In other words, without doing open heart surgery or doing a transapical approach, puncturing a hole through the heart. I think our big challenge is knowing how to attach to the valve how much regurgitation do we need to reduce to have a clinical benefit. And that's kind of a fundamental debate that we have to begin with, because the early predicate device, the MitraClip, which has done very well, doesn't obliterate this disease as we do in the aortic side. The aortic side, we're not satisfied unless we just obliterate the disease. In the mitral, I don't think we have to do that to have a clinical benefit. And then the question is, how close do we need to be to perfect to really benefit the patient optimally? And it's a fundamental question that we haven't answered yet. And I think we will over the next few years as we develop multiple kinds of products to treat this disease.
So Stan brought up an important debate that I want to ask Dr. O'Gara to kick off in a second. But before that, I'd like, Sean, you to weigh in on the complexities that you've seen as you've led the organization at Medtronic to approach the complexities of the mitral apparatus.
Well, thank you, Jason. And, clearly the disease itself is heterogeneous. The difficulty of designing an implant that's going to stay where you want it to stay, reduce or hopefully eliminate mitral regurgitation, and do that without a lot of morbidity for the procedure is one big challenge. Proving that out clinically, there's a lot to do for your clinical trial design as comparison, and then to compel reimbursement, referral, ultimately for our market development is difficult. I'd say the thing that makes us feel better, Stan talked a lot about the functional patient population. I'd say even with the degenerative disease, mitral valve repair is really an art, and the availability of great and talented surgeons, maybe you can go to Partners and a lot of other great fancy tertiary care centers and find a surgeon capable of repairing your valve without subsequent need for second repair. But the average mitral surgeon, or the average surgeon, I should say, does about 6 procedures per year. So you can imagine it's hard to get good at anything that you do 6 times in a year. And I think the opportunity is large. It's only large, though, if we can really reduce morbidity and produce that benefit for a patient. And I think because the patients are so heterogeneous, knowing who not to treat is going to be probably the most important thing we discover as we bring these devices into evaluation.
Thank you. Dr. O'Gara, moving back to you, simple question with probably a very complex answer. Do doctors wait too long to intervene into these patients? Do they?
Well, I think if you only took the snapshot that Stan provided about the 2.5 million patients with moderate to severe MR away from a session like this, I'm sure that you would try to ask yourself whether is it really true that all 2.5 million require a mechanical intervention to reduce their mitral regurgitation? And I think it would be fair to say no. I would like to emphasize a point that Ian made about the foundational approach to using medical therapy at every stage of the development of valvular heart disease over time in an effort to prevent the emergence of ventricular dysfunction or severe symptoms that require intervention. And we're talking here in this particular forum about intervention in the late stages of the natural history of the disease. We're not talking about innovation to try to prevent the continued progression of disease over decades that gets to this point. In functional MR, it could be prevention of myocardial infarction or genetic intervention to prevent the development of a cardiomyopathy. And in degenerative or primary mitral regurgitation, it might be about getting smarter of making genotypic, phenotypic correlations about what are the drivers by which the tissue becomes very fragile and no longer works, and cord snap and mitral regurgitation evolves. I think the other point that you're trying to make, Jason, is whether or not the screening programs that are currently in place across the United States specifically are adequate to identify patients with mitral regurgitation, to assess the severity of mitral regurgitation at time of identification, and then to make an appropriate referral to a more sophisticated center at which the patient can be more carefully evaluated and a consensus heart team approach to decision making made with the patient to determine whether or not they've reached a stage at which intervention is needed. And it is fair to say that we rely on our primary care community in order to first identify valvular heart disease expressed by the appreciation of a heart murmur. And at that point, an evaluation usually ensues. And I'm sure you've all been in your own primary care offices in which there is such a huge level of busyness and regulatory paperwork that oftentimes physical examinations are not performed as part of a routine annual visit. 2 or 3 years goes by, and the next thing you know, you determine that disease has already been established and you're a little bit late. There is no question that we can do better with identification, screening, and referral. And that is a societal problem that we need to solve across communities of care providers, including family practitioners, primary care physicians, pediatricians, nurse practitioners, and physician assistants. And there should be mechanisms by which we can improve on the score that we all would agree, Jason, I think is a little bit substandard for where we should be in the 21st century. But then it's just not a matter of developing that information in isolation. It's putting it in the context of what is the expected natural history. As many patients can do fine with medical therapy. And we have to be, I think, a bit more judicious in terms of not making an assumption that all of these patients need a mechanical intervention in order to live well or live longer. And my last comment would be a little bit more of a sobering nature. When we get to the point with patients with functional mitral regurgitation, to which Stan referred and Ian referred as well, who have ventricular dysfunction. The mitral valve is an innocent bystander, and the disease is intimately related to how poorly the left ventricle is functioning or how abnormal it has become remodeled. And it actually doesn't matter what we do to the mitral valve under those circumstances. Patients will not live longer, at least now, following a mitral valve intervention. They may live better, but they will not live longer. Mortality rates at 2 years for patients with severe ischemic mitral regurgitation after a heart attack, 20%. In the most recent randomized trial data that we have available, 20%, whether or not you have mitral valve surgery or whether you're treated with appropriate medical therapy. That's the problem at the beginning that we need to address as, I think, as aggressively as we're approaching the problem at the end of the natural history.
It seems to make the argument, and Ian, maybe I'll get you to weigh in here, that earlier intervention could not only bend the mortality curve, but it could bend the cost curve as well. There seems to be a circular problem here. We're waiting too long. There aren't good, perhaps, care pathways to get these patients to the right physician. Therefore, there aren't many interventions, and the spiral continues. Ian, talk about this juxtaposed to your experience in the aortic valve space, because there are several periodicals out there that would have argued that treatment of severe aortic stenosis was significantly low relative to the prevalence, yet TAVR came along and we've started to bend that curve. Can care pathways be developed or leveraged for mitral valve disease? Maybe you could weigh in on that, as well as the earlier intervention school of thought that Dr. O'Gara brought up.
Thanks, Jason. And yet again, Pat made very sage and wise comments about the management of mitral regurgitation, particularly functional mitral regurgitation. And perhaps I should limit these comments now to functional mitral regurgitation, because I think we understand better the care pathways for degenerative mitral valve disease once diagnosed. And I think we have a good understanding of that. But it does get back to what Pat was saying before. We do need very good care pathways in heart failure in general, and to understand the compounding effects of mitral regurgitation in that context. I do think that the data we see today really is a consequence of actually treating too late, so too little, too late. And I think we need to understand more about the role that mitral regurgitation is playing in begetting further mitral regurgitation and deteriorating ventricular and indeed atrial function, because I believe that atrial enlargement also contributes to mitral regurgitation by effacement of the leaflets from above. So we should think of it really as both atrial and ventricular problem, and atrial fibrillation, for example, can lead to mitral regurgitation just simply as a consequence of gross atrial dilatation. So we have to understand more about the mechanisms, and clearly we have to have better care pathways that understand how we intervene and manage and follow and pick the patients appropriately for the therapeutic options at the right time that perhaps can alter the natural history. I think we are treating very late in the condition, and it is true that we can make patients less symptomatic, but not necessarily alter their survival. And I think that is a key thing moving forward, is that we need to probably intervene earlier and more mechanistically on the causes of functional mitral regurgitation. But again, I'd like to underpin the importance of guideline-directed medical therapy, Hypertension, for instance, hypertension is a profound cause of left ventricular systolic dysfunction. Good management of that will prevent mitral regurgitation as a consequence of LV dysfunction. The other thing about hypertension is that in medical therapy, for most of us who have done these procedures in the cath lab, you can put on a mitral clip or put 2 mitral clips on and get a good result, lower the blood pressure a little further in the cath lab, and you've got no mitral regurgitation whatsoever. And it highlights the importance of blood pressure control in the dynamic response of mitral regurgitation. Simply lowering the blood pressure 10 points might reduce your mitral regurgitation by half. So understanding that and understanding how we should use that in everyday life to manage mitral regurgitation, understanding that in interpreting the results of the outcome of clinical trials is also very important. I think we really have to have very sophisticated pathways that understand the mechanisms of functional mitral regurgitation, intervene early in terms of risk factor modification for ensuing heart failure, have good guideline-directed therapy, and then have tailored therapies for functional mitral regurgitation early in the disease process. That's the only way that we'll ever determine whether this really can alter survival.
Thank you, Ian. Stan, let's go down to Sean and then work our way up, actually. Following up on what Ian was talking about, Sean, I'd like you to weigh in on, for the benefit of the investors and the innovators in our audience, whether you think this is a toolbox approach to treat functional mitral regurgitation. Will it be like TAVR, sort of a single bullet device that works for hopefully nearly everyone? And what do you think about the size of the market potential? Is this, in your view, as exciting longer term as TAVR?
Yeah. So I do think it's a toolbox approach. As described, you've got problems of chordal suspension and replacement you need to do. There's sometimes annular solutions that can work well for a patient that are good enough, as described. And replacement is also important if you can do that safely without introducing a lot of other complications like blocking off the aortic valve or some other kind of approach. So clearly there's going to be a lot of patient selection and devices sort of tailored for it. But my guess is that you're going to see the bulk of the market, if you will, that will develop in replacement just because it's going to give you a better result and more repeatable. And, I think we'd all agree that while we don't know the right degree of MR reduction, the more you do it in your time in an intervention, that's probably going to lend well for the patient that's going to benefit from mitral regurgitation reduction. I'm sorry, what was the last part of your question, Jason? The market
Talking
size?
about the longer term, are you as bullish about this?
There's a large patient population out there. We think we've got a good infrastructure that can be leveraged to be able to create these devices and get the training out there and if there's a benefit for patients. So we're bullish about that. But you said at the outset, it took 15 years to get TAVR to prime time. And we are really, despite all the acquisitions and flurry around this, we are really at the beginning of the beginning. But it's also important to be a first, second mover, third mover in this space. Because if you're not there early, if you don't really kind of set the right tone with picking good clinical trials, picking the right kind of technologies and driving them. So I'd say for the investors, this is probably outside of your 5-year dividend discount window for most of the things we're doing, but certainly important as we get to the next level of growth and penetration.
Stan?
Well, this isn't exactly like the field of dreams, build it and they will come. But I think there's some similarities to what we did in aortic stenosis too, that just building a transcatheter approach to treating mitral regurgitation doesn't mean all the cardiologists and all the patients will line up, but it's an attractive alternative to what they have today, which is either medical therapy or surgery. So what did we learn in aortic stenosis? I think what we learned is two things that were really important. One, there was a large number of underserved patients, and we quantified what the problem was, which patients would really benefit. And that's job number one for us, is which patients will benefit from these therapies. So defining that enables us to then do clinical studies which will prove something that's safe, effective, and cost-effective. And that was really the magic behind aortic stenosis. That and two companies doing a lot of important randomized trials that validated the approach. And I think that's what's going to take to build this field of dreams, which is careful clinical studies, quantifying the problem, and then validating a safe and effective and cost-effective therapy for that. And we are early on in that process, but there's certainly, I think, a large number of patients who can benefit from this, and some really creative solutions that are being proposed and studied.
Mike, Abbott was the first one to get an approval for a transcatheter device to treat degenerative, but used a lot for functional mitral regurgitation with the MitraClip. And you're also sponsoring the COAP trial. So what are the right patients to target? Should we be thinking about quality of life metrics in mitral valve disease more, or weighing it more than we maybe did in aortic valve disease versus quantity of life, if you will? Weigh in on those two items first, and I'd like to dive in with the group on clinical trial design. That's where I'm going.
Certainly. There's growing consensus that quality of life over quantity of life has got to be at least a part of discussion in the measures for these future trials. And this comes not from the idea that we're somehow settling for a less perfect procedure, but based upon the fact that quality of life measures, for example, the KCCQ measure, these are predictive measures of mortality, and these are also the measures that you'll hear from patients and their caring physicians that they say are important. So I think we will see more of those as part of the measures in these clinical trials as they go forward. I would also like to add to some of the questions that have just been answered by others that one of the things that we have learned from our customers around the world who treat these patients every day, predominantly in FMR, and to speak to that specifically, we have more than 50,000 patient experiences around the world over the last 10 years. Over 60% of that is in treating patients with FMR, often aged, well over the age of 75, comorbidities, and for the audience that treats those patients with significant experience with transcatheter solutions like MitraClip, their proposition would be that there is no longer a debate as to whether or not they're adding value by intervening in those patients, provided you can reduce MR to 2+ or less. And then when you further compare to the surgical literature, you understand that the outcomes at 1 year are not zero resolution. They're often 1 to 2. And so we do know there is a body of evidence to suggest that that is a marker whereby you begin to add real life, real benefits to an individual in terms of their quality of life as well as quantity of life. There are also 3 studies, all controlled RCTs, which will be reading out over the next 2 years to COAP we discussed. Mm-hmm. There will also be MITRA-FR in France, and then Reshape. Each of these will answer some of these questions in a controlled fashion. But most of us believe that those studies will confirm what we have seen in the literature today, which comprises more than 1,000 publications alone, just with respect to MitraClip, much of that in the FMR population, as well as numerous registries and retrospective analyses.
In other words, confirm that if you reduce MR to under 2, patients feel better and the quality of life metrics are they enough to bend the cost curve?
In the experiences that we have, where people have gathered that data and to look at it, the answer is yes. Simply because if you're feeling better, those patients are not being readmitted for treatment.
Dr. O'Gara, I'd like you to weigh in on that as well. Surgical colleagues tend to like to see 0 MR, which is okay. I'd like to have, hopefully we all have 0 MR up here on the stage and will for the rest of our lives, but is that the goal we should be targeting for these devices?
No, I think I agree with Mike and Stan, Sean, and others that for older patients with functional mitral regurgitation and abnormal ventricular function, sometimes a slight reduction in the degree of mitral regurgitation can help them live better, as measured by a quality of life survey, for example, or as measured by their ability to complete a 6-minute walk test. So there are objective ways by which we can get to trial design to ask relevant questions as to the utility of these kinds of interventions. I think that apropos to our discussion about market size and whether there are more patients that will come forward with mitral regurgitation once the technology matures, as seems to have been the case with aortic stenosis, that may actually come true. And that the technology may actually drive an increase in the recognition of the disease. And I think that it's also very important for us to make parallel innovative efforts to create the systems of care necessary to identify, screen, and evaluate these patients while the technology becomes more mature and more widely available. And then I think the second aspect of innovation, and I'm sure it's one that everyone here in the audience has thought of at one particular point in time, and that is, who should be doing these procedures? This is not simple stuff. Fixing a mitral valve with a catheter is really hard. And the training and the education and the experience that goes into that would seem to me to make it more likely that the number of centers providing these kinds of innovative therapies must be reduced in order to maintain the volume necessary to actually prove quality. And that is really 180 degrees at odds with dispersing this technology widely, but making the recognition that this is not a simple cardiac catheterization. This is not a picture of the coronary arteries. Mitral valve repair, I think, Sean, you said it, is an art. I think the same could be applied to transcatheter solutions for mitral regurgitation. And we have to be very careful and I think innovative in how we set up regionalized systems of care. And to your point about bending the cost curve, we've got to bring this together in such a way that systems are linked in order to create volume and to mandate quality and to do this in a way that everyone here, I'm sure, on the panel would agree has to be job number one. Patients need to do better. This is all really about the patient. And it worries me a little bit when we get from first in man to 500 centers doing TAVR, or first in man with a mitral clip and now more than 200 centers in the United States reporting to the TVT registry doing mitral clip. What's the right number? Maybe it's not the number, it's really who's there, the infrastructure necessary to do this. We're not going to bend the cost curve because we've got to do all this fancy imaging to try to define what patients are going to benefit most from these kinds of procedures. This is really expensive stuff, above and beyond the device.
Dr. Garrett brought up an interesting point there at the end. I'd like to jump to just really quickly. Mike, he mentioned imaging and fancy imaging. Working with MitraClip and within COAPT, you have this experience, maybe weigh in. Do we have the imaging today to be able to image the mitral valve in such a way that these devices can be delivered by, as Dr. Garrett mentioned, 500 or 600 hospitals?
Well, imaging is indeed a primary arbiter of the ability to proliferate these types of solutions in a safe and predictable manner. So transesophageal echo today is the primary means by which you would utilize a MitraClip system. For when we start thinking more broadly about transcatheter mitral valve replacement devices, that is where imaging is going to again be a primary arbiter. So transesophageal echo alone for those particular devices as they presently exist is insufficient. So you need to do, prior to these cases, procedural planning, utilizing CT as a minimum, all trying to ensure that you have the right device for that particular patient's anatomy, and then ultimately complement that with both your standard fluoro as well as TEE, again, during the actual use of those devices. So what we're really talking about is you need to be able to see it to do it. And so imaging, as it continues to improve, we also believe is going to allow for us to do these procedures in a better way than they can be done today, simply because of that fact.
That's helpful. And Ian, so back to Dr. O'Gara's point, there are lots of devices out there under development, many devices within each of your portfolios up here on the stage. They look different. Some are repair, some are replacement. We have a heterogeneous patient population that I believe Dr. O'Gara referred to as a concerto, as opposed to, I can't remember the analogy now, but I remember.
Woody Hayes.
Exactly, concerto. So how in the world are we going to homogenize a heterogeneous patient population enough within clinical trials to be able to see definitive data and also run all of these trials concurrently with all of these devices and all of these companies? It seems to be a tall task.
It is a tall task. I think I'll summarize it very simply. I think we will have a horses for courses approach, and that depending on the mechanism that is underpinning, and again I'm speaking here of functional mitral regurgitation, the mechanism that's leading to functional mitral regurgitation at a specific point in the disease process, we may have a specific solution. And I think the problem that exists today with many of the early phase clinical trials that are undertaken with new devices is to put every patient with functional mitral regurgitation into that study, even if the device may not work for all of the patients in that trial. And I think we'd have a much clearer understanding, even at this point in time, if devices, for argument's sake, annular devices, were dealing with patients that had predominantly annular dilatation without too much leaflet tethering and leaflet restriction, because pulling the annulus in won't really make much difference if the leaflets are tethered due to apical displacement of the papillary muscles. I'm sure Pat would agree with that. And I think we have to make sure that we understand where the different technologies will work, choose the patient populations accordingly, understanding that we might have hybrid approaches with the repair devices. And I think we have to stratify it like that, and we have to understand the mechanism very, very clearly, make sure that the device that we are choosing will fit or deal with that mechanism, or the combination of devices, if it is a repair strategy, will deal with that mechanism. And then for those who we believe are suitable for replacement, similarly, we have to meet all of the inclusion, exclusion, left ventricular outflow tract obstruction, mitral annular calcification, apical scar, all of these things have to be considered. So I think we have to run more specific clinical trials that are focusing on specific populations. I do think that ultimately, that as Pat said before, that having devices will crystallise our view of mitral regurgitation, particularly functional mitral regurgitation, focus and sharpen the clinical pathways, and therefore help feed the pathways into the right therapeutic option. But we do have to move into an age where not every device is used for every patient with mitral regurgitation, and that it will be, I think, a tailor shop, and we'll have tailors and they will have a haberdashery.
But just maybe time ending now, Stan and Sean, end with you to weigh in similarly, and your portfolios are quite extensive. What you see as the future, and also maybe weigh in on 15 years from now, will this be a bigger market than TAVR?
Yeah, I think there's definitely that potential for this to be a larger opportunity than TAVR. I think we have a lot of learning, all of us, to do. Not only what patient needs to be treated, how to access the patient, 500 centers. I don't know, there's 1,200 centers in the United States that do open heart surgery. You think that's a pretty specialized procedure too, and yet you have to have patient access. So a lot of patients don't ever get referred out of their narrow networks. So that, having access to these patients is a critical part of it. So I think we have to learn, which patients benefit. We have to do the right trials. We have to show economic, clinical benefit. And we have to adapt to a lot of learning along the way. But I'm optimistic that this is not only an area of high unmet need, but that some of these devices are going to have a big impact on patients and therefore create large markets.
Sean, any provocative statement to close the panel?
Provocative statement. I'll just say if it's half as big as TAVR, we're all going to be very happy.
Probably twice
Fair
the
enough.
size.
Well, I thank the audience, and I certainly thank the honorable panel for joining me in this discussion. Thank you very much.